Hello, and welcome to this special introductory episode of the FinCEN Report. I am Jonathan Wilson, and I am the CEO and one of the founders of the FinCEN Report Company. The FinCEN Report Company is an online service provider of secure collaboration and reporting services. The company provides those services to other companies that must file beneficial ownership reports under the Corporate Transparency Act. Now, as part of our mission to bring FinCEN filing services to the public, we are planning to host weekly web reports regarding FinCEN, anti-money laundering compliance, and related topics. We hope you enjoy these presentations. Feel free to reach out to me by email, jwilson@fincenreport.com, if you have any questions or if you would like to provide us with content for a future episode. Today, I'll be speaking with Professor Ola Tucker. She's a professor of law at the Widener School of Law in Wilmington, Delaware, and she's also the author of a new book on anti-money laundering called The Flow of Illicit Funds, a case study approach to anti-money laundering compliance. You'll meet Professor Tucker later in our show, and we'll also have a special discount that you can use to get a copy of her book. But first, the news. According to reporting in the Hartford Courant, a Manchester, New Hampshire man was sentenced to more than 6 years in prison for trafficking fentanyl and for money laundering. David Cintrone, 26 years old, was sentenced by U.S. District Judge Janet C. Hall in a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut, to a total of 78 months in prison and 4 years of supervised release, according to federal authorities. The Drug Enforcement Agency's Hartford Task Force began investigating a Mexican-based drug trafficking organization that was trafficking fentanyl and heroin in Connecticut in 2019. It found Cintrone, another individual, Armando Gonzalez, and others had received kilogram quantities of narcotics, including fentanyl, from a source in Mexico, and then distributed the drug to street-level distributors, again, according to federal authorities. Members of the organization delivered cash generated from the sale of those narcotics to a money broker in Brooklyn, who then assisted in laundering the proceeds before they were transferred to leaders of the drug trafficking organization. The authorities estimate that between August and October 2019, they generated more than $200,000 in cash that was laundered through the operation. Now, as part of the takedown, authorities seized various assets that they claimed were used in the money laundering operations, including 2 separate apartments. Cintrone, Gonzalez, and 3 others were arrested on federal charges in April of 2020, at which time authorities seized numerous bags of suspected fentanyl and other items used to process and package the narcotics, as well as weapons and ammunition. A grand jury in June of 2020 came back with an indictment against Cintrone, Gonzalez, and others, and Cintrone pled guilty in May of this year to 1 count of conspiracy to distribute and 1 count of possession with intent to distribute 40 grams or more of fentanyl. The DEA led the investigation with cooperation from the DEA's New York Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, as well as the New York Police Department. Meanwhile, in the state of Texas, the Department of Justice recently announced indictments against 2 Texas residents, Charles Ochi, 27 years old, and Vanessa Okocha, 24 years old, also for money laundering and related crimes. According to the Department of Justice, beginning in 2016, Ochi and Okocha conspired with others to launder and transmit proceeds of various Ponzi-styled investment schemes based in Nigeria and also romance-based scams. In particular, the investment fraud schemes were supposed to have offered trading and Bitcoin investing services when, in fact, the perpetrators were taking those investor funds and using them to pay off earlier investors. It was just a Ponzi scheme. At the same time, these 2 were also involved in various romance fraud schemes where they would try to deceive online victims into sending money to persons with whom they thought they had a romantic relationship, catfishing. The Department of Justice claims that Ochi and Okocha laundered the fraud proceeds as part of a network of co-conspirators in the U.S., including the owners of at least 2 used car exporting companies. Ochi and Okocha, along with their co-conspirators, did not hold money transmitting licenses in the various states, and they were not registered as a federal money transmitter as required by the Bank Secrecy Act, a law that, of course, is administered by FinCEN. The charge of money laundering, if convicted, provides for a sentence of up to 20 years in prison, 3 years of supervised release, and a fine of $500,000 or twice the value of the laundered funds, according to the Department of Justice. The charge of conspiracy to conduct an unlicensed money transmitting business and the charge of operating such an unlicensed business each also provide a sentence of up to 5 years in prison, 3 years of supervised release, and a fine of $250,000 or twice the amount of gain, whichever is greater. So that's the news. So for now, let's turn to Professor Ola Tucker in an interview that we recorded earlier. Joining us now is Professor Ola Tucker, who's a professor of law at the Widener Law School. Ola, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for having me on.
You've recently published a book, The Flow of Illicit Funds, a case study approach to anti-money laundering compliance. What prompted you to write the book, Ola?
Yeah, my book was published this past July, and it's my first book. And I've been doing compliance training for a number of years in-house to compliance professionals. I've done a number of webinars, and then of course I also teach compliance classes at Widener University, Delaware Law School. And I got the idea from my book from teaching. I noticed that when you use real life examples or current events from the news, it gets people more interested. They pay attention, they're engaged a little bit more. So I wanted to write a book kind of following that structure. A lot of compliance books that are out there tend to be a little dry. This one focuses on money laundering. If you've ever taken money laundering, anti-money laundering training, you know they kind of present it the same way. You know, these are the 3 phases of money laundering and so on and so forth. Well, I wanted to kind of illustrate what these phases look like. I wanted to give some examples that people may be familiar with. So
Sure.
that's where the impetus.
Without spoiling the book, you know, what are some of the examples, or maybe give us one of those examples that would be a good, you know, introduction to how the book flows and what sort of things readers could expect.
A lot of compliance books that are out there tend to be a little dry. This one focuses on money laundering. If you've ever taken money laundering, anti-money laundering training, you know they kind of present it the same way. You know, these are the 3 phases of money laundering and so on and so forth. Well, I wanted to kind of illustrate what these phases look like. I wanted to give some examples that people may be familiar with. So
Sure.
that's where the impetus.
Without spoiling the book, you know, what are some of the examples, or maybe give us one of those examples that would be a good, you know, introduction to how the book flows and what sort of things readers could expect.
The phases of money laundering are placement, integration. Let's start with those 2. So placement, what does that mean? That means placing money into the financial system, usually cash. But what does that look like in practice, right? This is going to look different whether you're in a bank, whether you're at an insurance company, whether you're in a casino, all businesses to which the Bank Secrecy Act applies. So I just use examples. So in one of my chapters, I talk about money mules and Smurfs, not the little blue guys, but the individuals who put money into an ATM or into the bank. They're usually recruited. And I describe how that process works, how you first put the cash into an ATM, make cash deposits, break it up into small quantities so that you avoid the reporting. And these are just the kind of examples that I use.
Sure. I know, you know, from popular literature, popular culture, we see TV shows like Breaking Bad and Ozarks. I know that they've used, you know, references to Smurfs and things like that, and breaking up deposits into small pieces. But does your book actually describe, you know, real life situations where law enforcement caught up with smurfing and that sort of things to talk about actual names and dates and places?
Yeah, I do. And each chapter always has a case study in it. So a real life case study. So I give several examples throughout, but there's one case study at the end of each chapter that focuses on each. So I use a very famous one that was recently in the news was Ghislaine Maxwell, who was associated with Jeffrey Epstein. So when I talk about shell companies, for example, in one of my chapters, I illustrate how she used a shell company to purchase real estate in New Hampshire and hide out there while she was kind of on the run from the law. And
Wasn't she eventually arrested at that house in New Hampshire?
she was eventually arrested, yes. And I write about this. It was difficult to identify who she was because even the real estate agent who sold her the house didn't know that she's the one who purchased it because she purchased it through a shell company.
So you were talking about the three phases: placement, integration, and then what was the third phase?
Placement, layering, and integration.
Layering and integration. Okay.
All right. So placement is when you first put the money into the financial system. Layering is when you engage in a series of transactions to kind of complicate it and cover it up. And then integration is when you finally integrate the money back as seemingly legitimate funds.
Gotcha. Is there a good case study from your book about the integration phase?
Integration is probably the easiest phases of all of them. The most difficult and the most likely where you're most likely to get caught is the placement phase, right? Because this is what banks and other financial institutions are trained to look for. Integration is basically after you've already placed your money and layered it. Integration is when you then go ahead and use that those seemingly legitimate funds to purchase a yacht, for example, or some other usually high value item. One thing I do say in my book is that this placement, integration, and layering, these three phases are a very simplified concept of the process of money laundering. What usually happens is that the phases are intertwined. You could have multiple instances of layering and placement before you finally integrate the funds and so on. So the phases can also blur one into the other. So it's not always entirely, black and white in order. Traditionally, in anti-money laundering training, we're taught about those three phases of money laundering. But what you really need to look at is you need to look a little bit broader. You need to look at what happens before the placement phase and what happens after the integration phase, especially as an enforcement officer tracking this stuff. Tracking money laundering. So you have to know certain typologies, a lot of groups that are involved in money laundering, and it's more often groups, criminal organizations, terrorist organizations, rather than lone individuals. So you look at their criminal enterprise, what they're into, where they operate, what kind of business they have. If you look at that and then where the funds are ultimately spent, if you look at kind of the broader picture, you're more likely to be able to apprehend the money launderers.
So I imagine that advice is more aimed at law enforcement than it is at banks and financial institutions who wouldn't really have the impetus or even the ability to look at the bigger picture. They only see transactions.
Right, certainly more at law enforcement, but sometimes, if you're working at a financial institution and you're able to have a better client relationship, for example, or have a look into where their source of funds is from, which you should be doing anyway, sometimes you're able to pick up clues. So it could be helpful for those working in financial institutions as well.
So we were talking earlier about the Corporate Transparency Act, and it looks like, breaking news, FinCEN has finally issued its final rules. It's so recent that you and I, haven't even read the press release yet. How is the Corporate Transparency Act supposed to help law enforcement fight money laundering once it is implemented?
Yeah, so the Corporate Transparency Act is a huge and significant addition to our anti-money laundering regime. This act is going to basically create a beneficial ownership registry that FinCEN will be in charge of. So beneficial ownership, it is not reported to any central authority when a company is created, an LLC, for example. Now, under this act, anyone who creates a company will have to report and update information about who the beneficial owner is of the companies that they're creating. So the real natural person, not another company, the person who actually owns and controls that company and has decision-making authority over that company, benefits financially from that company. So this is going to be significant. There wasn't anything like this before in the US. People could create, even foreigners could create companies in the US completely anonymously. And then, of course, once they do that, you can engage in all sorts of transactions across the globe anonymously. So this makes it very difficult for law enforcement. So beneficial ownership, it is not reported to any central authority when a company is created, an LLC, for example. Now, under this act, anyone who creates a company will have to report and update information about who the beneficial owner is of the companies that they're creating. So the real natural person, not another company, the person who actually owns and controls that company and has decision-making authority over that company, benefits financially from that company. So this is going to be significant. There wasn't anything like this before in the US. People could create, even foreigners could create companies in the US completely anonymously. And then, of course, once they do that, you can engage in all sorts of transactions across the globe anonymously. So this makes it very difficult for law enforcement. So, it all depends on how FinCEN implements this registry, how this information is used, practically speaking, but it certainly has the potential to be an enormous boost in terms of anti-money laundering.
And I guess we hope that FinCEN does a better job in the future about being able to track how its access to information ultimately gets used by law enforcement. I saw something not long ago. I think it was a GAO study on suspicious activity reports, and the goal was to determine to what extent were suspicious activity reports helpful to law enforcement. And so the GAO went out and did a study, and the answer was, we don't know, because there was no tracking between the submission of the SARs and law enforcement outcomes on the back end. So
yes.
Sitting here today, FinCEN doesn't even know whether the whole SAR process has an effect, whether it's a positive, a neutral, or a negative effect.
Yeah, there's still a lot of things that could be done to make this type of reporting much more useful. And certainly one of it starts with keeping track of this data that we don't have. Another area where we don't have good data is exactly how much money is laundered, right? Because it's such a clandestine activity. We only have guesses and estimates from the World Bank of how much money really is laundered globally. And another one, for example, are anti-money laundering money laundering prosecutions, right? A lot of charges are pled down. So we don't really have accurate figures about money laundering prosecutions either. So if we could get more information about this, that would really be useful.
And I imagine implementing these new rules is going to require a real change in mindset among lawyers and accountants and business people in the United States. I've had conversations with lawyers when I describe the Corporate Transparency Act, and their first response is sometimes, well, gee, my clients don't want to do that. How can we avoid this?
And I don't think there's going to be avoiding it, honestly. The focus on corporate transparency in recent years and the focus on the US in particular, and even the UK, is really strong. Especially now, right, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and all these Russian oligarchs trying to hide their money and attention on sanctions and sanction screening and tracking assets. So this law is very timely. I think once FinCEN creates the registry and the law is implemented, I think from there things are going to ramp up pretty quickly.
And that is a great note to end on. Ola Tucker, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm definitely going to have you back. Your book, The Flow of Illicit Funds, a case study approach to anti-money laundering compliance, is available now, and would encourage all of our audience to go out and grab a copy.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I'd just like to mention, if you go to the Georgetown University Press website directly, which is the publisher of the book, if you use code TGUF, you could receive 30% off a print copy of that book.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us here at FinCENReport.com. If you would like to get a copy of Professor Tucker's book, please go to the University of Georgetown Press at georgetown.edu. We'll include a link here on the website. Please use discount code TGUF to get the discount that Professor Tucker mentioned in our interview. Thanks again, and we look forward to speaking with you soon again here at FinCENReport.com.